Hello, and thank you for being back with us on our channel. We're going to continue with our study in the Gospel of John, and we're in John chapter 5. We find that it begins by saying, "After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem." Well, if you go back over to John chapter 2 and verse 13, this is when Jesus went up to Jerusalem for the Passover. And many people believe that this particular feast here in chapter 5 and verse 1 is having reference unto Pentecost. Notice what took place there in verse 2. Now there was at Jerusalem by the sheep market, that is the sheep gate, a pool. Notice that it was referred to in the Hebrew tongue, Bethsaida, having 5 porches. Now, what would take place? In verse 3, in these lay a great number of sick folk, people, of course, who had various kinds of ailments, such as being blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. Now, why in the world did they do that? Well, the reason being is because God, of course, shows mercy unto those individuals who were sick, and He was there to help them. The reason being is because in verse 7 it says, "For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water, and whosoever then first, after the troubling of the water, stepped in was made whole of whatever disease he had." And of course, as I said, God, of course, was showing mercy unto these individuals who were sick. And this was also an opportunity to prove that Jesus is the Son of God. And you might say, well, why? How? Well, let's notice as we continue on. Notice that there was an individual there that had his particular problem for 38 years. He was infirm, so he could not walk. And the problem that he had was that when the water was troubled by the angel, he could not get down into the water because, as we said, he was infirmed. Now, it says there in verse 6, when Jesus saw him lie, that is, when Jesus saw him laying there, and knew that he had been there for a long time, he said unto him, "Will you be made whole?" Of course, Jesus is asking him if he wanted to be made whole. Well, the impotent man misunderstood what Jesus was saying, and thus he answered him in verse 7, "What? Sir, I have no man when the water is troubled to put me in the pool, but while I am coming, another steps down before me." And so he's thinking along the lines that the only way that he could be healed of his lameness was if someone would be there with him to help him to get into the water before anyone else would get there. Well, Jesus said in verse 8, "Arise and take up thy bed and walk." Now the man understood that Jesus was going to heal him, that Jesus had the power to heal him. And we find in verse 9, "And immediately the man was made whole, and took up his bed and walked, and on the same day was the Sabbath." Now you kind of wonder why that little statement is made there at the end of the verse. Jesus healed individuals on the Sabbath, and you'll find that because of him doing so, he got into a lot of hot water with the Jewish authorities, especially the Pharisees. Now remember, we said that the Pharisees was the strictest group among the religious world, or in the religious world at that time, among the religious people of that time, those Jews. And so they not only believed in and held to the law of Moses, which they were supposed to do, but you'll find that they also held on to the customs of their fathers. Now, these customs, of course, were not a part of the law of Moses. But what they did is that they started adding things to what the law said, and as a result of having done so, they made things very, very difficult on people. Jesus there in Matthew chapter 18 deals with this problem. He says, "Why do you transgress the law of God by your own commandments. And what he was talking about there are those commandments from their fathers, not the law itself, but the customs that they had tacked on to the law. And so here Jesus heals this man on the Sabbath. He tells the man to get up and take up his bed and walk. But notice the problem. In verse 10, the Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, this is the Sabbath day. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed. And so they have a problem with it, okay? And of course, in connection with this idea, it would be something like a mat that he'd be laying on. And so it wasn't really a big deal, but to them it was. Why? Because of the traditions or the customs of their fathers, the commandments of their fathers. And so they have now found fault with what Jesus has done. And so the man just simply answers them by saying, he that made me whole, the same is he that said what? Take up thy bed and walk. Now, they have just found out that this man has been made whole. Probably already knew that he was lame and that he was there. We don't know that. But now they know that he has been made whole, and that the one who made him whole was also the one who said, take up your bed and walk. And then in verse 12, they ask him, what man is that which said unto thee, take up thy bed and walk? And he that was healed knew not who it was, for Jesus had not conveyed himself, or had conveyed himself away, and the multitude being in that place. And so here we find that Jesus did not show his identity unto the man. He just simply went off into the multitude or the crowd of people. And so the man does not know. Now, as you go on, notice in verse 14, afterward Jesus found him in the temple. And this is interesting because notice where he went. He went into the temple. This is probably something he was not able to do. Matter of fact, you might recall that as far as the religious services were concerned in the temple, someone who had health problems were not able to participate. And because he was lame, he was not able to go. What he was trying to do is to make sure that he was healed. And so he was there at the pool. And no telling how often he was there at the pool, maybe even every day. You just don't know. And so now he is in the temple, and Jesus finds him and says this. He says, behold, thou art made whole. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto you. Now, why did Jesus say this? What had happened to this man? Well, we really don't know what happened. And we realize sometimes that because of God's natural laws, things happen to us. We get sick. Sometimes we might have an accident. And because of sickness, because of an accident, we may even become lame. There are certain diseases that people can get sometimes that will do that. But on the other hand, there are also things that we can do that will cause us to become sick. And we don't know exactly what it was, but undoubtedly, Jesus is telling this man that his problem that he was having was because of some sin. And not only that, Jesus says, what? He said, thou art made whole, sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee. And so what we need to do is, if we're involved in sins that are destroying our bodies, which are the temple of God, the temple of the Holy Spirit, then we need to quit doing those things. Sin's something that gets us into such trouble. Not only can we have physical problems as a result of certain sins, things that I think about is alcohol abuse, individuals drinking and then destroying their livers, drugs, wherein a lot of times the drugs will destroy certain organs in our bodies. And there's other things that a person might get involved in that's going to hurt them physically. Well, what do we need to do? Well, we need to quit doing those things. Somebody might say, well, what if the damage has already been done? You need to quit doing those things. And so we've got to come out of sin. Whatever it was that was going on in this man's life, Jesus saw the need to say, don't do those things anymore, because if you continue to do those things, something worse might happen to you. So let's make sure that we turn away from sin and that we will not allow ourselves to continue in sin that kills us spiritually for sure, but also how that those sins can destroy even our bodies. Notice in verse 15, the man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus which had made him whole. And why did he do that? Well, remember, they have asked him, and I guess he somewhat felt obligated to tell them, but it could be also that he was so happy that he finally found out the identity of the one that he had to let others know. Notice in verse 16, and therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus and sought to slay him because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. Now think about that, would you? Jesus healed a man, and instead of rejoicing because this man who had been sick all those many years, how many years? 30 and 8 years? Instead of rejoicing that this man had been healed, they found a problem and said, well, you did it on the Sabbath day. And of course, the Lord answers them. But notice what happened as a result. They sought to slay him, and they persecuted him. And so now we find that the Jews are actually going against the very Son of God. They're fighting against the very Son of God, looking for opportunity against him to persecute and even to slay him. And so it's really a sad thing to think about that these individuals who had allowed themselves to buy in to the commandments of their fathers, not the law of Moses, but what their fathers said about the law and the things that they attached to the law that was custom or commandments of their fathers, that they would actually now turn away from the one that God sent to save the world. And so here we have this problem that arises. Now, the rest of the chapter, Jesus is going to be answering a number of things concerning their arguments against him. And it's really good to notice the arguments that they make and the answers that Jesus gave unto those arguments. This, of course, will help us to realize that we should not allow the traditions, the customs, and the commandments of men to cause us to go against God and what God tells us to do. Well, thank you for being with us today. Hopefully this has been a beneficial lesson, and Lord willing, we'll see y'all tomorrow.